and humanity intersects in such a meaningful way. So for those of you who do not know me, I am Dr. Shaniva D. McReynolds, honored to be the president of FAMM, and I will be your moderator for today's conversation. And I want to start by saying this. This conversation is not just important, it's necessary. FAMM, originally Families Against Mandatory Minimums, is a national nonpartisan organization that has been working for over 35 years to create a more fair and effective justice system. We operate both at the federal and state levels, and our work is rooted in a few core principles: that accountability and dignity can coexist, that public safety and second chances are not in conflict, and that the people closest to the system should have a voice in shaping it. Our community, our family includes people who are currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated individuals, family members, survivors, advocates, system stakeholders from all across the country. And what brings us together is a shared belief that our justice system can and must do better. So that brings us here today, and why we are talking about faith. April is Second Chances Month, which makes this an especially fitting time to reflect on the values that drive this work. Because when we talk about second chances, we are inherently talking about redemption. We're talking about mercy. We're talking about the belief that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done. And for many people across different backgrounds and experiences, those beliefs are deeply rooted in faith. Now at FAMM, we are not a faith-based organization. We are proudly nonpartisan, and we represent people from all walks of life across the full spectrum of beliefs, traditions, and perspectives. But what we see time and time again is that faith, however it is defined, shows up in this work in powerful ways. For some, faith is what sustained them during incarceration. For others, it's what compels them to advocate. And for many, it's what allows them to hold space for both accountability and compassion at the same time. And even for those who do not identify with a particular faith tradition, there is often still a belief in people, in growth, and in the possibility of change. And that belief is just as powerful. So today, it's not about promoting any one faith. It's about understanding how faith in all its forms intersects with advocacy, with justice, and with the human experience inside and around this system. And so, we're happy to bring this panel together and make space for the stories that do not always get told, and recognizing that people impacted by the system are not a monolith. There is no single way to experience loss. There is no single way to experience accountability, and there is no single way to believe in redemption. But together, those perspectives help us build something better. So I am honored to be joined by this incredible group of panelists today, each bringing their own lived experience, their own perspective, and their own relationship with faith into the conversation. And so before we talk about faith, it's important for us all to ground ourselves with who's in the room, because every perspective on this panel comes from lived experience in a different way. So I am honored to present to you Miss Anne Marie Easley, who is the Assistant Warden 4 at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. She began her career in corrections 25 years ago, and prior to that, she was a school teacher. Imam Al-Amin, who embraced Islam 30 years ago during his incarceration and was released after 3 decades. Today, he serves as an imam and is respected for his leadership and mentorship of youth. Shauna Rifkin, who is FAMM's phenomenal general counsel. Shauna directs FAMM's Federal Compassionate Release Clearinghouse work. She oversees FAMM's Supreme Court practice and advocates for reform of federal sentencing and correction law and policy before the United States Sentencing Commission. She also covers Congress, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the United States Department of Justice. And last but not least, Mr. Matthew Charles, who is FAMM's State Legislative Affairs Manager. Matthew was sentenced in 1996 to a 35-year federal sentence. His sentence length was the result of an unjust disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And after serving 22 years on that sentence, he became the first beneficiary of the First Step Act signed into law in 2018. Well, I guess before we continue, I'll briefly ground myself in this conversation as well. For me, faith and advocacy are deeply connected, but not always in easy ways. I come to understand faith as a thing that you hold on to when the answers aren't clear, when you're navigating pain, loss, and questions that don't have, I guess, clean resolutions. And so, as a mother and a widow of my first husband, who we lost to gun violence, a mother of that young girl who was only 2 months old, my perspective has been shaped in that tension between what we've experienced and what we still choose to believe is possible, between harm and the hope for something better. And that lens shapes today's conversation. So thank you all for allowing me to share that. And I hope that this conversation makes clear that there is no single way to come to this work and no single way to experience this system. All right, so let's get going. This question is for all of our panelists. And Shauna, I'll start with you. Tell me, or us, if you will, a bit about your journey and your relationship to the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Geneva, and thanks so much for the introduction. So, when I think about this question, I think about a former client of mine who passed away this October. And in one of our conversations, he said to me, Shauna, you have not spent time in prison. You don't have family that spent time in prison. Why do you do this work? And when he asked me this, it's true. I'm not impacted in the way that many others on this panel are, and many others that we work with. But when he asked me this question, I thought back to when I was around 10 years old and I was in Hebrew school, and there was this older woman who walked in and she started talking to us, and I could see numbers tattooed on her wrists. And those numbers were tattooed on her wrists from a concentration camp that she had lived in Germany. She was a Holocaust survivor. And she talked to us about, state-sponsored dehumanization, about persecution of people, and about how she had been reduced to a number instead of a name, instead of a person. All of her humanity had been stripped away. And that is the story of many of my ancestors. And my journey with faith is not, I'm not a very religious person, but I think what I've learned was that if I were alive, at that time in history, regardless of how much I identify as a religious or non-religious person, I am Jewish, and I would have been seen as a Jewish person just the same way that this Holocaust survivor was. And so the Jewish faith, the Jewish tradition and history is full of people being subject to state-sponsored dehumanization and persecution. And so although I personally have never experienced incarceration, when I work with people every day who too are reduced to a number, they're not called by their name. They're not considered for all of the beautiful complexities that make them a human being. They're referred to as their inmate number, the same way that this woman was referred to and labeled and tracked using a number that was tattooed on her wrist. And so that really is kind of what brought me to this work initially, and what, in many ways, what sustains the work that I do.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Shauna. Anne Marie, how about you?
I'll have to say it's part of the way that I became a part of corrections is part of where my faith comes from, because I believe that God puts you in places that he needs you. I was a school teacher 25 years ago. If you would have said that I'd be working in corrections, I'd probably look at you like you were crazy and you didn't know what you were talking about. There was no way that was going to happen. I briefly went to work for a computer software company, an educational software company. Lasted for 4 months. It was Welcome to Corporate America. They bought out part of another large computer educational software company and had to lay off 180 people. Last one hired, first one fired. So that lasted for, like I said, about 4 months. It's hard to get a teaching job in the middle of the school year. So I found a teaching job in the paper for a juvenile facility. Of course, this is back when you had to go to the classified ads to look for jobs. So I called somebody that I knew in corrections and said, Number one, do I want to go to work there? And if I do, can I use you as a reference? And they said, we're getting ready to start a youthful offender program at Dixon Correctional Institute, and we need to hire 2 teachers. Call on Monday and let's set up an interview. And I got hired as a teacher there. I've had a really tough road as a woman in a male dominant field. So there have been several things that have happened along the way. I spent about 7 years there, and then went to Angola and have been there ever since. But I just feel like God placed me there for a reason. And it's to work with these men. These men also have strengthened my faith as well because of what I get to witness every day. But that's basically how I ended up in corrections. Like I said earlier, I would have never dreamed that I wanted to be a teacher. That's what I went to school for. So.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Anne-Marie. Alameen, please share a little bit about you and your journey with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. It's an absolute honor, privilege and pleasure indeed to be, on such a panel with such esteemed individuals and, with the public listening, on such a, tremendous topic. My journey, with the criminal legal system, is personal. It's deeply personal. I didn't learn about the criminal legal system, from a textbook or, watching a documentary or something like that. I lived it. I spent the greater part of 30 years in prison. I was incarcerated at a very young age as a youth, as a juvenile. I was sentenced to not just life in prison, but natural life in prison without any possibility of parole, plus a consecutive 30 years, plus a consecutive 12 years, and an additional consecutive 82 months in a federal prison. So I was literally sentenced to die in prison, right? At a young age. And so, I ended up spending, 30 years of that life sentence incarcerated, dealing with the horrors of prison, dealing with everything that comes along with losing your freedom, losing your connection to your family, your community, your loved ones, your children, spouse, everything. And so in that time, the time in prison, it was a time, prison, it could take your freedom, but it doesn't have to, steal your dignity or or your heart. Right. And so it was a time, that I utilized, it was a transformational period in my life, but make no mistakes about it. It wasn't a criminal legal system that, did anything in the way of rehabilitation or my transformation. It was all people like Katrina, people like yourself, people on the panel, people who were in the discussion that, attributed and contributed to my transformational progress. And I think I speak for most individuals that are incarcerated. And so I was released. I was just released. I had the great honor and fortune, a beautiful blessing, a miracle indeed to, that was bestowed upon me. I was just released July 29th of last year from federal prison, from up under a sentence that, according to the judge, I was never supposed to come from up under. But I was released and restored back to my family and back to my community. And today, you introduced me as an imam. I received that title. It's a title. It's a title. Imam means, like leader. I was fortunate enough to study under a great scholar while I was in prison. He was a volunteer. He came out to the prisons to teach us. And he appointed me acting imam of the maximum security prison that I was at. I held that role from 2009 until I left the prison. And then when I came home, people who had heard about the work that I was doing in prison, they began to look at me and view me as an imam. They called me imam, which means the leader. And so since I've been home, I've been guiding and, teaching inside of masjids on social media, mentoring youth to try to keep them away from the same system that, that pulled me in, trying to get them to understand that the system, it'll pull you in, and it might not spit you out. And if it spits you out, you may not come out the same. So I've been doing that work since I've been home, and it's an absolute, it's humbling work to do, and it's an honor to be here today on this panel.
Thank you, Imam Alameen. We appreciate you. And last but not least, FAM's very own Matthew. Matthew, many people know you, but for those who do not know you, can you please share your story briefly?
Okay. As Geneva stated, my name is Matthew Charles. Briefly sharing my story, my journey was long and arduous. The pivoting point was in 1996 while in the county jail in Clarksville, Tennessee. A friend of mine who actually was from Mexico named Jesus Duran, he had drove a tractor trailer load of marijuana through the state of Tennessee and ended up being arrested and was in the same county jail I was. And because me and him were friends in there, not knowing each other before then, he ended up being able, because his family was well off, being able to get a good attorney and was able to go to court and get a 5-year sentence. And once he received that 5-year sentence, as he was leaving, he gave me all of his possessions. And in his possessions, unbeknownst to me, because we never talked about God, I never believed in God up until these chain of events took place, because I was born in the mid 60s, and from the age of 6 years old upward until I graduated high school, my father was a very verbally and physically abusive person. So from the age of 6 years old, I can recall being beaten, made to stand up to be beaten and knocked down again so many different times until I just stayed on the ground. So that was my life up until the time I actually graduated high school, joined the military to get out of that type of environment. But once I joined the military, I felt that they also had strong control over my life. And the only difference was I wasn't being physically beaten, but I was verbally being abused. So I did my term. And then once I got out of there, I just decided to live my life my way. Bad decision, because my way was based off of the anger, the abuse, the trauma, everything that I had suffered as up until the point that I decided to get out of the military. So once I got out of the military, I just started making wrong decisions, and that led me to periods of incarceration. But back to what I was stating, I ended up being in the Clarksville County Jail with Jesus Duran, and when he was leaving, he gave me his possessions, and in his possessions was a Bible. So I ended up taking that Bible, didn't intend on reading it. Like I stated before, I never believed in God because he never showed up at my parents' household and spared me, my siblings, or my mother from the verbal or physical abuses that we had suffered. But I took them because I wanted some of the other things that he had and that he was giving me. And once he gave me those things, because I'm in the county jail, books are non-existent or very low. I actually read that Bible, but I read it as a book from front to back. And God, doing what God does best, reached in and penetrated my heart, broke open the shell, and I accepted Christ as my Savior. And doing so, that was the turning point for my entire life after that. And I was sentenced to 35 years, about 10 months after I made my profession of faith unto the Lord Jesus Christ. And when I went in federal prison, I just started doing everything that I possibly could to learn more about my faith. So that's what caused me to be on the journey that I was on. And God has continued up until this point to open doors for me. And that's how I ended up coming to FAMM. A situation came about that allowed me to be released for nearly 2 years and be ordered to go back, not because I violated any condition of supervised release, but because the prosecutor appealed my initial release and won. So I was told to self-surrender and return. And at that time, FAMM felt that that was harsh and unnecessary and decided to get in contact with me and some other people that were talking about my case and asked could they utilize that as a talking point or to be able to speak with legislators about the unnecessariness of sending somebody to prison that no longer needs to be there, whenever public safety is no longer in jeopardy. And afterwards, I was released and invited to come to FAMM, and being able to come to FAMM, seeing FAMM being a national nonprofit that actually works on behalf of the families of those that are incarcerated and those that are incarcerated, and me leaving so many of my brothers behind. I know women are incarcerated as well, but leaving so many brothers behind that had similar situations like me that wanted to be released just like me. It just was a door that God opened that I feel walked straight through, and has continued to do so and fight on behalf of the men and women that are incarcerated today.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing that. What we're already hearing is that the path into this work and through the system is deeply personal, right? So for many of us, faith has become part of how we make sense of that journey. And so, Shauna, I have heard you talk about being driven to this work from your earlier career as a lawyer in private practice and a law clerk in the federal system. Can you tell us and our listeners about how faith informed that move into your advocacy work? And now that you've been at FAMM for many years now, how does your faith inform your work now?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So I think, I started off my legal career as a law clerk in a federal court in the Western District of New York. And that district is on the border of the United States and Canada. And so it's a really heavy criminal docket. And I had always been interested in criminal law, but it wasn't until I got into the district court that I really saw the machine of criminal law and of the criminal system. And I think at that point, I started to think about what it meant to be involved in the criminal law and the criminal system. In law school, you have all these really heady ideas of justice and equality and things that you're taught, the way that the system should be. And then when you graduate, for me, when I graduated and I was working in the court, the difference between how the system should be and how the system actually operated was so stark. And that really lit a fire in me. And that fire has, I think, really continued and propelled me forward. In Judaism, there's a concept called tikkun olam, which is Hebrew, and it means to repair the world. And I think when you're in a criminal court, it feels like there's no way to repair the world because it's just the system functioning as it functions. And so from that experience, I think what I took away from that was how I could use the skills that I have to help repair the world a little bit more by helping make people feel seen and heard, and like they matter and like they are worthy of redemption. And that's really what I do at FAMM every day, especially on the Compassionate Release Clearinghouse, is really work to make people feel like, their journey has hope. I try and convince federal judges to use mercy and leniency for people who have made a mistake but are so much more than their mistakes. There's another phrase, I think that comes from the Torah and the Bible. In Hebrew, it's tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, which means justice, justice, you shall pursue. And it's one of my favorite sayings, and it's one that I think about a lot because the repetition of justice, I think, makes me reflect on that. Justice is not inherently just. Justice is something that you have to work towards. And so the faith for me is working towards justice, working every day towards making justice more just and more compassionate, and helping to bring ideals of mercy and leniency into a system that is so lacking, and to make people who are a part of that feel seen. I think leniency and mercy is something that's a through line through many religions. And so being able to work every day towards those endeavors and towards those goals really makes me feel connected to something bigger than myself.
Thank you for that, Shauna. It's powerful. And as we stay in this, idea of faith, you kind of teed me up a bit to shift us into what it looks like in the most difficult moments, right? Particularly during incarceration. And so, Matthew, I'd like to go to you, and then next to Imam Al-Amin. I want to ask you, Matthew, I mean, you've already spoken about the importance of your faith. Can you talk a little bit more about that during your time of incarceration, and also how your faith impacts your commitment to this work now?
Yes, faith is, like I said, very, important due to the fact that while you're incarcerated, especially since I was incarcerated for 22 years, your faith will be tried. There are situations that take place while you're incarcerated that are so unexpected, but your response normally is based on your faith, because a lot of, like Shauna had stated a few seconds ago, when it comes to a lot of different beliefs, the beliefs are set in customs, traditions, tolerance, self-control, just thinking and having an openness or readiness of acceptance. So there are situations that arrive to where I was wondering if I was going to ever get out of prison. I remember when Booker versus United States passed, and what Booker versus United States done was it made the sentencing guidelines advisory instead of mandatory. As a matter of fact, the United States Supreme Court had ruled in that case that the sentencing guidelines were unconstitutional, being mandatory. They're still supposed to consult the guidelines, but they're now advisory. And then they didn't make that retroactive for all of us that were still incarcerated. So we had hopes when the Booker decision came out that it would allow us who were under the mandatory sentencing to get a second look, and it never happened. And a lot of us had actually been praying that decision would pass and that it would help us. And it actually helped a lot of people, but it didn't help us that were already incarcerated. And then there were times where it just seems like all of the laws, because I was considered a career criminal, so it seemed like a lot of the laws that were being passed never were able to be made retroactive, or the Sentencing Commission never allowed those who were sentenced as career offenders to be able to benefit from it. So that's where I state that faith was tried. But the thing about faith, Paul says in Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's a funny scripture, because it's saying we understand substance as something that we can see. You know what I mean? The matter that does exist. And it's telling us that faith is equivalent to that. So it's telling us to see beyond the natural eyes and to the third eye, or the spiritual eye. So being able to hang fast on that, I just continued to believe that God would open the door for me. And then God in his timing did open the door for me. So faith is very instrumental in not only my everyday living, but also what I do for those that are still incarcerated, because my faith allows me to be open-minded. It allows inclusiveness, as opposed to just being able to state that if you don't think like me, believe like me, or look like me, then I have nothing for you. Now, prior to me becoming a Christian, that was my mindset. I hate to share this with the audience and the listeners and the panel, but prior to that, I hated people. I didn't want to talk to anybody because of the way that I was raised. So therefore, the nature of who I am now is completely as opposite as you would ever imagine as the person that I am today. And because the reason being I didn't like people, it was because I didn't trust people. So faith is very instrumental in not only, like I said, the work that I do, but all those that I continue to talk with and be around each day, because it just shows me I'm no longer the man that was molded by anger, bitterness, hardship. And I am that person that God said I am, a new person in Christ.
Thank you, Matthew. And for Imam Al-Amin, would you tell us about how your faith was important to you during your time of incarceration and how it shows up in your life now?
Yeah, sure. First of all, brother Matthew, man, welcome home, bro. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, bro. You know, we got a lot in common, man. You know, and it's, alhamdulillah, I love hearing about, your story. Listening to Sister Shauna, Dr. Shaniva and Matthew, the whole system, this whole criminal legal system, it's just such a burdensome and debilitating system. And I mean, it's just so burdensome and debilitating. You know, and you know, you at your lowest point. You know, when you're incarcerated, especially the type of sentences that Matthew and I had, but any type of sentence, right? You at your lowest point, and then the system itself, the way it's set up, it doesn't lend to any, to treat the person like a human, like your humanity is like stripped away, not simply because your liberty has been taken through your incarceration, but the way you're treated once you're in the system, right? It's like it's so debilitating and dehumanizing, like this, like the whole system, like the way it's just set up, and it's bad. It's bad, So when a person is in a situation like that, when your liberty has already been taken away, right? Justly or unjustly, right? We can debate back and forth, whatever, right, about that. The system, you're back against the wall. Like your back is like against the wall. Your liberty has been snatched, and now you're a part of a system that's built to beat you down, right? It is nothing about the system that kind of lends to the upliftment of the person outside of the work that Katrina does, and most volunteers. Like, I applaud those type of individuals who that sacrifice their time, their wealth to try to come into a system, to overhaul a system and provide services and resources that the system is supposed to be providing for the people that they choose to incarcerate, right? It's not the Katrinas of the world or the Dr. Shanivas of the world and, the people who volunteered to come out to the prison to teach me, right? Or the programs Matthew was a part of. Those individuals shouldn't be charged with the responsibility of bringing hope to individuals through a system that's supposed to be built upon the rehabilitating the hearts and the minds of the people, right? That reality alone, like, that's a sobering reality of the system, right? It just tells us how, even the word broken, I don't even know the term. Right? It's just so depressing, right? And so when you're in a system like that, when you're back against the wall and you're looking around and like, man, I'm up against it, not just in the court, but in this system, you ain't got nowhere else to turn but God. You can't, any human being, whether you believe in any type of organized structure, religion, when you were out or not, in that moment, when all the lights is out, and that moment of silence and that moment of like that true reality hit you, it's nowhere else to turn but God. Your mother she's not going to be able to do for you that your creator is going to be able to do and provide for you. Even though we lean on our moms, like we call mom and just that soothing voice, at that moment, mom can't do it. Pops can't do it for me. Nobody can do it. You turn to God. You got nowhere else to turn.
That's powerful.
So you turn to God. Go ahead, sister.
Oh, no, I apologize. That's powerful. That's powerful.
Yeah. You turn to God, and you hear the stories, and it makes me cringe. When you hear the stories, the stereotypes. Oh, they found God in prison. Well, whether you found God in prison or you found him under Lord Wacker Drive under a bridge and homeless, that's what people normally find God when they're at their lowest of the low. So it's nothing. It's not by chance or happenstance that most individuals, when they enter into that cycle, that system, that they find God. They don't necessarily find God. They turn to God. Yeah. They turn back to what's natural, because that natural orientation, right? And look, we may have people who in the comments who maybe, don't believe in God. But at the core of a human being, we know naturally that it's something higher than me. Like it's something, whatever you choose to call it, a higher power, entity, whatever it's something higher than me, right? And you turn back to that naturally. You don't have to read a book to know this. No one has to tell you this. Your nature causes you to make that 360 or that 720, that 180 turn back to what's natural. And you turn to God. You turn to God. And you cry out. Go ahead.
You said something, Imam Alameen, about, basically what our listeners are thinking. And we have some amazing questions that I feel that all of you all can address. And so I'm glad that you're thinking through that, because there is one question that has come in that I think you're going to be able to speak truth to. And so I want to get us through a few of these questions, of the panel questions, so we can look to the listeners and you all can, impart some wisdom. So, I want to ask, we've heard from those of you on the panel who have experienced incarceration directly. And I think that was where I really wanted us to start as we got going, from the two gentlemen who multiple decades of time, right? It's hard to even say it. And Imam Alameen basically telling us all what we know we're here for is there has to be something that grounds you and gets you through that. But now that we've heard from those that have experienced incarceration directly, I want to widen the lens and talk a bit about faith from within the system that you just spoke to, Imam. What faith from within the system itself. And so Anne-Marie, you also see faith at work behind bars every day. From the other side of the equation, and as an officer in the Louisiana correction system, one of the hardest that I know people hear about often, how has faith been important to your work, both personally and professionally?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I found God in prison too. And I found him in the men in prison. My faith has become stronger because of what I've witnessed in the men inside of Angola. I don't have to say that Angola's reputation precedes itself. But fortunately, we are not what we were in the past. And I'm truly honored and blessed to work there. I've been to other prisons, and I just see how we provide an opportunity for men to truly grow and to be the men that they were meant to be. But I've seen where men of any one particular faith accept men from all other faiths. I tell people all the time that the men at Angola could teach the rest of the world about acceptance and just welcoming men. You're not going to see separation in our prison. They're going to attend each other's churches. They're going to support one another. And just to see them, for men to say that they're freer there than they've ever been in their life. I mean, to be in prison and behind bars and to be able to express that and say that is amazing. So just to be able to witness guys accept Christ and be able to conquer their drug addiction. Louisiana is a state where life means life. Second-degree murder, life is life. So hope can be lost at a place like Angola. And I feel like it's my responsibility and part of my mission to keep that hope alive for the men that are there, because they can have the best life possible, even though they're in the situation that they're in. And part of that is whether it's whatever faith you choose, whoever you see your higher power to be. I think it's so important for that to happen for the men, especially, dealing with the trauma that they've experienced. I tell people, in the past, it's been very common to talk about the trauma that leads women to prison, and we don't address the trauma that leads men to prison, because it was, whether it was taboo or it just was, wasn't very masculine to be able to talk about the trauma that men experience. But the more I do the work that I do, the more I see and internalize and feel for the men that are there because of the trauma that they've either experienced prior to coming there, or even the trauma after coming there, especially when you're talking about juvenile lifers that came there 30 years ago. Obviously they experienced trauma. So those things have to be dealt with. And to see men, rely on their faith and live the way that they do there has just been, it's been unbelievable. It's why I continue to do what I do. I just think the men there could teach so many life lessons to people all across this country. They can be assets to their communities because of what they can teach, especially the younger generation, to not follow in their footsteps. I have mentors that are working with short-term offenders that are going to be getting out. The reason why that program is so successful is because of the mentors who are lifers. It's not because of staff. It's because the mentors are relatable and can encourage these young men that they're working with to not end up where they are. And they want better for them. They want for them to go out and to be successful. They bring them to church with them. And it's just, for me, my faith, like I said, has become stronger because of the men in prison, because I get to witness it firsthand.
Thank you for that. I want to take a brief sidebar real quick. This conversation is so good, and I looked at the clock and I'm like, oh no, we're running out of time. But I need to do two things here. So Imam Al-Amin has mentioned on multiple occasions Katrina. Her name is Katrina Baugh. She is FAMM's Senior Policy Director. So I just wanted to kind of bring some context into who Katrina is, because she clearly has had a profound impact on the imam's, time of incarceration. So I just needed to introduce who Katrina Baugh is, even though our panelists, our listeners do not see her. And then to kind of let us know, to give us all kind of a time check, because we do have some great questions coming through. So I think 2 more questions I want to ask each of you to get your feedback. And so let's try to let's work really hard to be super as amazing as we are in like maybe 60-second, 90-second answers, and then see if we can take some of those questions from the listeners, because their questions are so phenomenal based on what they're hearing from all of you. And I want to make sure we get to those. So across these experiences, faith doesn't stay static, right? It evolves. And I'd love to hear, I guess in a brief way, how that evolution has shown up personally. So let's bring this into the day-to-day context. Faith isn't just something we hold. It's something we practice, especially in spaces that can feel extremely heavy or even hopeless. And all of you have spoken to that. So, Anne-Marie, I'll come right back to you. Every day, your job involves keeping people safe from despair. How does that part of your work involve your own faith and ability to connect and inspire faith, or at least counter despair, if faith is something opposite of despair?
I think, first of all, one of the things that is really important is to be able to show the humanity inside of those fences. So I think it's really important to bring people in from the outside so that we can dispel the stereotypes about men serving time. I think it's important. That helps to bring them hope. So I do a lot of that. I think bringing them from the outside so they see we're not what you see on TV, because we're not that at all, and that helps, whether it's people of faith or people of, community leaders or whomever. But I do bring a lot of faith-based groups in, and keeping hope alive keeps everybody safe. It keeps the inmates safe. It keeps staff safe. It keeps everybody safe. And we've got to do that, because when men lose hope, they're going to turn to drugs. They're going to, they're going to not care about things, and we need to keep that hope alive. And a lot, it's whether it's through faith or whatever the case may be. I feel like that's a really important part of my job.
I love hearing that, especially as a wife of a formerly incarcerated individual. Like, just knowing that that mindset does exist, from an individual that works as a part of that system. For those of us, or those of you now doing advocacy, I know for me, faith has always showed up in how I engage the world. So Matthew, I mean, would love to hear. I know, especially in spaces that aren't always receptive, right? That's always a challenge. So Matthew, you're out here, you're on the ground, you're doing the work, the advocacy. How does that faith come into your interaction with lawmakers in your direct advocacy? Can you share that with our listeners?
Faith plays a major part in it because of the fact that I believe everyone is redeemable. I don't have to look far when I ask my question, am I sure about someone being redeemed? I can just look in the mirror. I can just look down at my hands without a mirror because I was redeemed. So I believe in redemption. And whenever I speak with legislators, especially in some of the states that we consider Bible Belt states, a lot of them, being of the conservative mindset, believe in the Bible. And because of their belief in the Bible, they have a deep conviction. They believe that they are, public's morality. So therefore, they believe that they are public, morality watchdogs to make sure that we don't get too far away as a society from continuing to do what is right and wrong. And that normally turns into them writing or supporting bills. So whenever I speak with lawmakers in regards to that, I like to go in, and sometimes I like to share my story, which is very unpleasant if you hear it all, but it allows them to be able to see that I'm sitting here speaking to you as a person who has changed my life because of my profession of faith in Christ Jesus. So therefore, just me believing that everybody's redeemable, understanding depravity, believing that a lot of times you do see people that you consider incorrigible, but that's like 5% of the population and not the 95%. It's when the lawmakers believe that it's the 95% of those that are incarcerated are incorrigible that you run into all those different problems and dilemmas. Yeah. But I try to let them know that most people will change. Most people change for a volume of different reasons. And I'm a living witness to that change as well. So just being able to, like I said, believe every day that people are redeemable, being able to understand my own past, my own life lived, and some of those that I've experienced that are still incarcerated, that were my mentors, that were my shepherders, that also helped me along in this walk, that are still behind bars, and I think are better men than I am. So just being able to share that with legislators, lawmakers, being able to remain humble and understanding and open, because one thing that oftentimes religion does, it allows you to be inclusive. It allows you to be able to be open-minded as opposed to close-minded and closed-hearted. So that has helped me to be able to continue to do the work that I do, whether it's speaking with my neighbor, whether it's speaking with a legislator, or whether it's being able to go to church with some of my church friends.
Thank you for that, Matthew. You actually helped kind of drive me towards the next question for Shauna. I want to make this even more tangible by connecting faith to specific areas of advocacy work. So Shauna, you work a lot on compassionate release. How is that work related to your faith?
Yeah, I think compassionate release is the most Jewish thing that I can do. Compassionate release is really about the idea that we are all human. We are all people who make mistakes, and we are all worthy of redemption, compassion, mercy, and leniency. And for me, it is integral to my view of faith to use my voice to try and fight for justice for those people and to help them feel like they are worthy and they are valuable. I mentioned earlier, working in the courts, you really see the machine of the court system. And for me, silence is complicity. And so being silent about the machine when I have the tools and the voice to be able to fight for justice would make me complicit in that system as well. And I refuse to do that. I'll just say one really interesting experience that I've had in the Compassionate Release Clearinghouse is that for many of the people that I work with there, they've never met a Jewish person. They don't really know what Judaism is. Sometimes I work with people who tell me that, you know, they grew up around neo-Nazis. They grew up around learning to hate Jewish people. And so that personally has been one of the most challenging and also reaffirming experiences for me, that reaffirms my faith, my identity as a Jewish lawyer who's fighting for people, not just people who are Jewish, but for people all across the country who may or may not have a similar background for me, because that's what it means, in my view, to be Jewish, is to stand up and use my voice to make people feel worthy and to fight for them.
Oh, that's profound. Thank you, Shauna. So I'm going to pivot here. I know I'm supposed to ask a couple of more questions. I am going to ask one question to Imam Alameen, and then I'm just going to go, Imam, if you'll take about a good 90 seconds to answer the next question, then I want to jump into the comments so we can get some questions. I'll throw them out to all the panelists or anyone on the panel, can respond. But I'd love to bring in the voices from our listeners so you all can, talk to them. And so, Imam, this is going to be so hard to ask you to cram this into 90 seconds, but, faith and reason, are sometimes framed as opposite, but in reality, many of us hold both at the same time. I know you were extremely involved or very involved on the debate team while you were incarcerated in Illinois, which in some ways is also the opposite of faith. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I am so sorry to ask you to cram it in, but I just need our listeners to hear this.
Yeah, no problem. Look, I had the wonderful opportunity, and by the way, you didn't mention Katrina. She was our debate team coach, and so she came out and she taught us debate. And sometimes debate and religion kind of, get, misunderstood. I think debate is an integral part of all fields of life, right? It's about, flushing out the truth, having an intelligent, intellectual conversations at the end of the day. And so let me just say, Dr. Shaniva, look, I'm a survivor. I come from the lower rungs of, society, in this country. I hail from the south side of Chicago, the Inglewood neighborhood, probably the most treacherous neighborhood in the city of Chicago. Definitely, the lower rungs, swept up in the system. Of course, as you know, sentenced to natural life in prison, had the opportunity to meet Katrina and learn debate. In debate, in Islam, they go hand in hand because it's all about intellectual discussions, and now being released, right? That debate, I bring it out, to the outside world when I'm in society, especially when I go back to my community, when I'm dealing with the, with the youth, to be able to communicate. One thing we learned in debate is how to be effective communicators. You have to be, right? And you learn how to listen, because you have to listen to whatever argument your opponent is presented. And so that has aided me in my walk of life, in my faith. And in Islam, one thing about Islam teaches, it's about justice. There's a principle that is founded upon in its justice. And we're tasked, every Muslim is tasked with the obligation of saving just one life, right? Because in the Quran, there's a verse that says to save one life as if you've saved the entire humanity. And so we look for that one person. And so when I go back to these communities, right, I look for that one individual that I can reach, that one individual, that one young man, that one young woman, right, that I can reach. And then, like Matthew, telling the stories of the individuals that are formerly incarcerated, because I now, being in their shoes, I represent them, right? And so I must represent them to the fullest. And so Islam impresses upon me the obligation to do that, to try to save one life and to be the best representative of humanity that I can. And debate, it aided me in that, to make me, to show me how to be an effective communicator, and to be able to be compassionate and be a listener, which is one of the most important tools that we must have when we're dealing with people.
Thank you for that. I just needed our listeners to hear that and connect those dots, and then also kind of really be a full circle moment to who Katrina is. And
Yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
you said something. You mentioned where you're from. I too, we spoke about this before. And I'm from Inglewood in Chicago on the South Side, and as you said, one of the most treacherous neighborhoods to go up in. And I love to tell people, and therefore you and I and my husband are, we're the poster child of that. Something good can come from Inglewood, and so I share that forward. Okay, we got a few minutes, so I want to bring up, man, we might go past, my team might get a little frustrated. I mean, we might go 5 minutes past 12, but let's take at least 2 or 3 of these questions. So from our family members, Anne Marie, one of our family members asked the question. I too want to hear your answer on this. Do you find that most of the staff are also believers?
So, first of all, we have over 1,200 employees, but I can say that all of the staff that I work with directly and have worked with, which is a great number of them, are. And our warden, who wouldn't mind me saying at all, is absolutely a believer. And he is concerned with every soul of every man that is incarcerated at Angola.
Thank you for that. I think that's a reality that people need to hear. I was talking to someone about one of the wardens at an institution in Illinois that I met, because I even sometimes have to dispel the myths in my head, and he showed up is in the way that I would hope that a person that is responsible for a population that's in cages to show up in the same way it sounds like your warden does. And I'm grateful and bless God for that. One of our family members has asked, how can we still expect the system to cater to our well-being and transformation when it is designed to keep us incarcerated by our self-defeating thoughts, tendencies, actions, and values? I just want to throw that out to one of the panelists, and maybe you can try to address that in about 60 seconds.
Yeah, the expectation for whoever asked that question, the only thing that you can expect from the system is what you've been getting, right? I don't think too much is going to change. What I would say, because this panel is about, I would say, faith in action. Whatever faith that you hold, put your trust and your expectations in that, and turn to your Creator. Put your faith and trust in Him, and just continue to push forward. Panels like this, the work that FAMM is doing, alhamdulillah, tremendous work. They have lawyers on the team, Sister Shana, Brother Matthew, the excellent work that he's doing. Reach out, become an integral part of FAMM, and try to get the resources that they have available to try to help you navigate through the system.
That was one of the things that I was going to bring up. I mean, really encourage their loved ones to take advantage of the programs and the things that are available to them, to encourage them, pray with them on the phone, when you get that opportunity, if it's available in visiting, whatever the case may be, but really to take advantage of the programs that are there, faith-based, self-help, whatever they may be, but to make valuable use of their time while they're there, take advantage of education programs, whatever that may be, because I think those things help to build self-worth and self-esteem, and just encouragement from their family members.
And just another point, questions like this, it just speaks to, how the family members of those incarcerated, they go through this with us, right? They're impacted as well. And so, her question, and I read it beforehand, like I can hear the emotion pouring out right through her question. Like that's a real serious question. Her loved one, whomever that is, may he or she be well while they're in prison, but may your trauma be healed as well, because you're going through it as well. And so again, circles like this, having that connection, to your spiritual based community, and making sure that you and your partner, y'all continue to vibe be that connection for one another. That's key. And they understanding on the other end that you need that emotional support as well. And so for the person who asked the question, I feel for you. My heart goes out to you. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. It's tough.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I know we're at time. I just want to kind of wrap up, man. The questions that are coming through the chat, I wish we could stay on here and answer all of them. What I will do is I just want to kind of pivot here and say we have a copy of those questions. Maybe my team, we can find a way to, send an email out to all of our listeners with the answers to those questions we'll get our panelists to see if they'll give us a moment of their free time to respond to those questions. But thank you all for your honesty, your vulnerability, and your commitment to this work. What we've heard today is that faith doesn't look just one way. It doesn't belong to one story. It doesn't belong to one experience or one outcome. So for some, faith carried them through incarceration, as many of us heard. For others, it guides how they serve, advocate, and lead. And for many, it's something that's been tested, sometimes shaken. And I think to one of the questions our family members was asking, sometimes shaken but never fully lost, I believe is part of the answer. I stand here as someone who has experienced this system from multiple angles. As a survivor of a husband who was murdered, as a wife of someone who was incarcerated, and I'm still happily married to him. I think he is the greatest thing. And as an advocate fighting for a more fair and effective system. And so what I know is this: accountability and mercy are not in conflict. Justice and humanity can coexist, and faith, however you define it, can be the bridge that gets us there. So whether your faith is in God, in people, or simply in the possibility of change, hold on to it. Hold on to it, because transformation, personal and systemic, requires all of us to believe that something better is possible. So thank you today to all of our panelists. This was powerful. Thank you today for all of the listeners that paused their day, the middle of their day, to join us. And please continue to show up, because the people both in the system and those returning, and the loved ones, as Imam Al-Amin mentioned, that have endured the system alongside someone, we all need you. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you for having me.